The Sullivan Mystery, when children vanish. In the early morning hours of May 2nd, 2025, two children disappeared from their rural Nova Scotia home. But here's what makes this case different. Their mother waited 2 full hours before calling police. 2 hours. While 4-year-old Jack and 6-year-old Lily Sullivan were missing, their mother Malaya sat in silence. When investigators finally arrived, they found a house in chaos, a family torn apart, and a mystery that would expose the dark underbelly of Canada's child welfare system. What happened during those 2 hours? And why, months later, are there credible reports that these children are alive and hidden somewhere in the United States? If you're drawn to cases that challenge everything we think we know about missing children, hit that subscribe button now, because 98% of you watch our content without subscribing, and frankly, that makes it harder for us to bring you these important stories. If you won't subscribe, at least tell us why in the comments. Part 1. The morning everything changed. The silence was what woke Janie Martell that morning. Not the screaming that came first, but the silence after, thick and unnatural in the Nova Scotia countryside, was what made her blood run cold. Janie had been sleeping in the trailer parked on her son Daniel's property, something her daughter-in-law Malaya didn't know. As far as Malaya was concerned, Janie was away with her boyfriend, leaving the main house to the family of 5. Daniel, Malaya, baby Meadow, and Malaya's 2 children from a previous relationship, 6-year-old Lily and 4-year-old Jack Sullivan. At approximately 5:30 a.m., Janie jolted awake to the sound of Lily's distinctive scream. Not the terrified kind. Lily was known for her piercing, excited outbursts when she got worked up. But this scream was followed by frantic barking from Janie's dog, then the unmistakable sound of the back door opening and closing. Through the thin trailer walls, Janie could hear Malaya's voice, hushed but urgent, ushering the children outside. She heard footsteps crossing the gravel, moving toward the gate that opened onto the rural road. The baby, Meadow, was crying softly. Something was wrong. Janie threw on her boots and tied up her still barking dog. By the time she made it outside and walked quickly toward the commotion, everything had changed. There stood Malaya by the roadside, holding baby Meadow. But Lily and Jack, the children Janie had just heard moments before, were gone. Vanished. As if they had never existed. Where are the kids? Janie demanded. Malaya's response would haunt the investigation. They're in the woods. But Janie knew what she had heard. Children's voices, footsteps, movement, and then nothing. No sounds of kids running into the forest. No distant laughter or crying. Just the terrible quiet of an empty road and a mother holding only one of her 3 children. 3 hours later, at 8 a.m., Malaya would claim she couldn't find Lily and Jack anywhere around the house. But she wouldn't call police until 10 a.m., a 2-hour delay that would become the first of many red flags in a case that would expose generational trauma, systemic failures, and a mother's desperate attempt to protect her children from a system she believed was designed to steal them. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived to find a chaotic scene. The house was described as messy, unsanitary, and barely suitable for children. Daniel Martell, the children's stepfather, appeared cooperative but strangely composed for a man whose stepchildren had just vanished. Malaya was withdrawn, vague about details, and her story seemed to shift each time she told it. Search teams immediately questioned whether the children could have simply wandered into the dense Nova Scotia wilderness. Locals insisted there was no way Lily, mature enough to care for her little brother, would have led Jack into dangerous territory without being heard. The forest was vast, but not silent. Children that young would have cried, called for help, made noise. Yet despite intensive searches involving drones, canine units, and hundreds of volunteers, no trace of Lily and Jack was found. No clothing, no footprints, no evidence they had ever entered those woods. More troubling was what searchers did find, or rather, didn't find. Malaya's extended family, despite the massive community response, never showed up to help search for the missing children. Not her mother, not her siblings, not a single relative from her side of the family participated in the efforts to find Lily and Jack. As night fell on May 2nd, Investigators were left with more questions than answers. 2 children had vanished in broad daylight from a home where adults were present. Their mother's story didn't add up. Their stepfather was too calm. And somewhere in the growing darkness, Lily and Jack Sullivan remained missing. What nobody knew yet was that this was just the beginning of a mystery that would span international borders, expose the dark legacy of Canada's treatment of Indigenous families, and force everyone involved to confront a terrifying question. When does a mother's love become so desperate that it destroys everything she's trying to protect? The answer to that question would come soon enough. But first, investigators would discover something that changed everything: proof that the children had been alive and well just hours before they disappeared. If you're following the story, subscribe now, because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about this case. For weeks after Lily and Jack Sullivan disappeared, one question haunted investigators and the public alike: when were the children last seen alive? Speculation ran wild online, with some theorizing that something had happened to them days or even weeks before May 2nd, and that someone, possibly Daniel, was staging an elaborate cover-up. Then Daniel Martel stepped forward with evidence that would reshape the entire investigation. On May 1st, 2025, just one day before the children were reported missing, the entire family had been captured on surveillance footage at Highland Square Mall in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. All 5 of them together: Daniel, Malaya, baby Meadow, and both missing children, Lily and Jack. "We were all together," Daniel told investigators, his voice steady despite the weight of suspicion that had been crushing him for weeks. "The camera got all of us at the mall. We looked like any other family on a normal day." The RCMP seized and authenticated the footage. There they were, a seemingly ordinary family on what appeared to be a routine shopping trip. No signs of distress, no visible tension, no indication that within 24 hours, 2 of those children would vanish without a trace. For Daniel, this footage was vindication. It pushed back against online accusations that he had harmed the children days earlier and then waited to report them missing. It proved that as of the afternoon of May 1st, both Lily and Jack were alive, healthy, and with their family. But the footage also created a more disturbing timeline. If the children were seen alive on May 1st and reported missing the morning of May 2nd, then something catastrophic had happened in the narrow window between late evening and early morning. What could cause 2 children to vanish so completely in such a short time? The answer might lie in what investigators found next: evidence that Malaya hadn't just panicked that morning. She had been planning. According to Daniel, in the days before the disappearance, Malaya had requested only specific items from their home: the children's birth certificates, school photographs, and 2 of their favorite stuffed animals. Not money, not clothes, not personal belongings. Just the documents and items needed to establish identity and provide comfort to frightened children. That's all she wanted, Daniel recalled. Everything else she owned, clothes, documents, personal items, remained at the house. The selective nature of her requests painted a picture of someone preparing not for a moment of panic, but for a deliberate plan. Birth certificates could be used to cross borders, establish residency, or enroll children in new schools. The stuffed animals weren't random. They were specifically Lily and Jack's favorites, items that would comfort them during a traumatic separation from everything familiar. But there was something else, something that investigators have kept largely secret: a note. The RCMP confirmed the existence of a handwritten message, though its contents have never been publicly released. The mere fact that law enforcement acknowledges its presence while keeping it sealed has sparked intense speculation. Was it a goodbye letter? Instructions for someone else? A confession? A cry for help? The timing of when this note was written and when it was found remains unclear. But its existence suggests premeditation. A written message implies Malaya had time and intent to prepare for whatever happened next. This wasn't necessarily panic. It might have been planned. To understand why a mother might plan to take her children and run, we need to look deeper into Malaya's world, a world shaped by trauma that stretched back generations. Malaya Brooks Murray was a member of the Sepeknik First Nation, a Mi'kmaq community in Nova Scotia. Her story cannot be separated from a dark chapter in Canadian history known as the 60s Scoop, a systematic removal of Indigenous children from their families that continued for decades and, according to many, persists today in different forms. Between 1960 and 1990, an estimated 20,000 Indigenous children were removed from their homes and placed with non-Indigenous families. The stated goal was to help these children escape poverty and dysfunction, but the result was cultural genocide. Children grew up severed from their heritage, their languages, their identities. Many suffered abuse in their new homes. The suicide rates were staggering. For Malaya, this wasn't ancient history. It was family memory, passed down through generations of Indigenous women who had learned that love wasn't enough to keep their children. The state could take them at any time, for any reason, and there was nothing a mother could do to stop it. In 2016, Indigenous children made up just 7.7% of Canada's child population but accounted for over 52% of all children in foster care. In Nova Scotia, where Malaya lived, Indigenous children represented 4.1% of the youth population but nearly 30% of children in care. The numbers told a story of ongoing discrimination, of a system that still saw Indigenous families as inherently unfit. Child Protective Services had opened a file on Malaya and Daniel in the months before the disappearance. The details remain sealed, but those close to the situation believe it stemmed from concerns about mental health and home safety. For Malaya, this wasn't just bureaucratic inquiry, it was existential threat. She had already suffered through an abusive relationship with Cody Sullivan, the biological father of Lily and Jack. The psychological damage from that relationship, combined with postpartum depression after Meadow's birth, had left her struggling with PTSD and overwhelming anxiety. Her greatest fear was that Child Protective Services would use her mental health struggles as justification to take her children away. And that fear, rooted in generations of colonial trauma, may have driven her to make an impossible choice. But Malaya didn't act alone. In the days before the children vanished, she had visitors. Women who would make statements so eerie, so specific, that they still send chills down the spines of everyone who heard them. Subscribe if you want to know what they said, because 98% of you are watching without subscribing, and honestly, that makes it harder for us to investigate and share these stories. What happens next will make you question everything. 3 weeks after Lily and Jack Sullivan were reported missing, a hairdresser in Plattsburgh, New York, just 90 minutes south of the Canadian border, made a claim that would either break the case wide open or prove how desperately people wanted to believe these children were still alive. According to Darren Geddes, a relative of the children's mother Malaya, the hairdresser insisted she had seen both children in her salon on May 26th. If true, this sighting would mean that nearly a month after their disappearance, Lily and Jack were alive and had been transported across international borders. The timing was disturbingly perfect. May 26th gave someone 3.5 weeks to move the children from Nova Scotia to upstate New York, plenty of time for a carefully coordinated cross-border operation. The witness reportedly recognized the kids, likely from media coverage, and was certain enough of her identification to contact someone about it. But here's where the story gets complicated. Darren shared this information during a YouTube interview, claiming he had confirmed it independently, but he never revealed the hairdresser's name or provided verifiable documentation. Without the witness stepping forward publicly or law enforcement confirming the lead, the sighting remained tantalizingly unproven. What made this claim more credible, however, was its connection to a theory that had been circulating since the early days of the investigation, that Lily and Jack had been moved through Indigenous reserves where Canadian authorities faced significant jurisdictional limitations. The path from Nova Scotia to Plattsburgh would logically pass through the St. Regis Mohawk Reservation, a unique territory that straddles the borders of Ontario, Quebec, and New York State. This cross-border Indigenous community has historically been known for loosely monitored crossings, making it an ideal route for someone trying to avoid government detection. Darren claimed it was ironclad that the children had been transported through this reservation, suggesting it was a deliberate choice by those helping Malaya evade law enforcement. Under Canadian law, The RCMP would face significant legal barriers attempting to retrieve children hidden in that jurisdiction without extensive court processes or cooperation from U.S. agencies. But the theory of Indigenous involvement went deeper and darker than simple geography. In the days immediately following the children's disappearance, Malaya had received visitors at her home, a group of young women, one of whom Darren referred to as the psychic. What this woman said next would haunt everyone who heard it. Standing in front of multiple witnesses, including law enforcement officers, the woman made a bold and eerie statement. The kids are being tucked into nice warm beds in New Brunswick. When Janie Mackenzie, the children's grandmother, challenged her, "What do you know about it?" the woman's response was chilling. "I'll be visiting them in a couple of days." Janie, disturbed by the comment, immediately kicked everyone out of the house. But for those who heard it, this wasn't just a strange prediction. It sounded like inside knowledge, like a plan. New Brunswick, while not directly tied to the St. Regis Reservation, contains several First Nations communities where enforcement might be delayed or complicated. The woman's specific mention of the province, combined with her confidence about visiting the children, suggested a coordinated network of people helping to hide Lily and Jack. The theory gained more traction when investigators found physical evidence near the Sullivan home that suggested the children hadn't simply wandered into the woods. Boot prints were discovered near the driveway and along a pipeline trail, one in a muddy area that Janie had filled the night before, right at the spot where the family dog had lost the children's scent. To those convinced the children were taken rather than lost, these prints told a story. The children had been led to that point, possibly to a waiting vehicle, and then transported away. A blanket found later in the woods was dismissed by some as a setup, previously discarded and potentially planted to suggest the children were lost in the forest rather than removed by human hands. Meanwhile, Darren claimed that a secret police operation had taken place at the Millbrook Reserve in Nova Scotia in the early hours of the morning, precisely at 4:24 a.m. He suggested the RCMP had conducted a pre-dawn raid, possibly attempting to catch someone off guard while they were sleeping. The specific timing struck him as suspicious and intentional, raising questions about whether law enforcement suspected the children were being sheltered within the reserve. Indigenous reserves in Canada exist in a unique legal gray area. The RCMP cannot freely enter or search these lands without judicial authorization or cooperation from tribal governance. This creates what some refer to as a jurisdictional vacuum where enforcement becomes complex and often delayed. For someone looking to hide children from authorities, reserves could provide temporary sanctuary while longer-term plans were arranged. But despite all these theories, all this circumstantial evidence, and all the dramatic claims, one crucial piece was missing: hard proof. There was no CCTV footage from the Plattsburgh salon, no security camera confirmation of the children crossing borders, and no photo evidence supporting any of the witness accounts. The hairdresser remained anonymous. The psychic visitor was never identified or questioned publicly. The boot prints could belong to anyone. And the RCMP's silence on whether they had actually raided any reserves left the public to speculate about what, if anything, law enforcement truly knew. Still, for families holding out hope, these theories provided something precious: the possibility that Lily and Jack were alive, hidden but safe, waiting for someone to uncover the path they had been taken on. But if Malaya had truly orchestrated an elaborate plan to move her children to safety, why did she leave Baby Meadow behind? The answer to that question reveals the most heartbreaking contradiction in this entire case, and it's about to change everything you think you know about this mother's impossible choices. Subscribe now, because 98% of you aren't subscribers yet, and frankly, that's disappointing when we're working this hard to bring you these untold stories. The system's shadow. Of all the contradictions in the Sullivan case, none is more haunting than this. Malaya Brooks Murray, a mother so devoted to Baby Meadow that she once told Child Protective Services, "I'm protecting her from you," ultimately left her youngest child behind when she disappeared in June 2025. Everyone who knew Malaya described her relationship with Meadow as intensely protective, almost possessive. Daniel Martel recalled how she would block him from seeing his own biological daughter, insisting that she alone knew what was best for the child. Meadow wasn't just her youngest. She was her anchor, her purpose, the center of her world. So why? When Malaya allegedly orchestrated an elaborate plan to save her children from the system, was Meadow conspicuously absent from every reported sighting? No one claimed to see her with Malaya in New York. She wasn't mentioned in connection with the routes through Indigenous territories. When Malaya vanished in June, she appeared to have left alone, or only with Lily and Jack. The answer reveals the devastating reality of how deeply the trauma of Canada's colonial policies had damaged this family. To understand Malaya's choices, we need to understand the shadow that hung over every Indigenous mother in Canada, the legacy of what became known as the 60s scoop. Between 1960 and 1990, Canadian authorities systematically removed approximately 20,000 Indigenous children from their families, placing them with non-Indigenous families under the assumption that their communities were unfit to raise them. The practice was sold as rescue. Poor housing conditions, substance abuse, and the ongoing trauma from residential schools were cited as reasons why Indigenous children needed to be saved from their families. But instead of providing support, education, or resources to strengthen communities, the state offered only one solution: removal. The emotional toll was catastrophic. A 1980 study found that over 78% of Indigenous children adopted into non-Indigenous families experienced psychological or physical abuse, and over 70% of transracial adoptions ultimately failed. Children grew up severed from their culture, their language, their identity. Many never learned they were Indigenous until they were adults. Suicide rates soared. Addiction followed. The trauma became generational. What was once called the 60s scoop evolved into what advocates now term the Millennium Scoop. Indigenous children in Canada are still being apprehended at disproportionate rates. In 2016, they made up just 7.7% of the child population but accounted for 52% of all children in foster care. In Nova Scotia, where Malaya lived, Indigenous children represented 4.1% of youth, but nearly 30% of children in care. For Malaya, a member of the Sepeknik First Nation, this wasn't historical curiosity, it was lived reality. She carried the cultural memory of generations of Indigenous women who learned that love wasn't enough to keep their children. The state could take them at any time, for any reason, and there was nothing a mother could do to stop it. When Child Protective Services opened a file on her family in the months before Lily and Jack disappeared, Malaya didn't see bureaucratic procedure. She saw the continuation of a centuries-old pattern of state violence against Indigenous families. Her mental health struggles, PTSD from an abusive relationship, postpartum depression, anxiety, weren't just personal challenges. They were ammunition that could be used to justify taking her children away. This context helps explain the impossible calculation Malaya may have faced in those final days. By June 2025, when she disappeared, CPS had already removed baby Meadow from her custody. The system she feared most had already won the first battle. Meadow was under state supervision, and any attempt to flee with her would trigger immediate criminal charges and possibly ensure Malaya never saw her daughter again. So perhaps Malaya made the most heartbreaking choice a mother could make. She cut her losses. She accepted being separated from Meadow temporarily, believing she could save at least Lily and Jack from the same fate. She may have convinced herself that once the situation cooled down, once CPS lost interest, once she had fully disappeared, she could find a way to reunite with all her children. But that miscalculation left Meadow in the hands of the very system Malaya had spent her life fearing, and eventually back in the orbit of Daniel Martel, the man she had once fought to keep away from their daughter. The irony is devastating. While Malaya is rumored to be in hiding, possibly across international borders, Daniel, once accused and ostracized, has been granted supervised visits with Meadow. In late June, during a live broadcast, Darren Geddes confirmed that Daniel had been allowed to see his daughter again for the first time in nearly 2 months. It was beautiful, Darren said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a moment that represented both progress and tragedy. For Daniel, this supervised visit was vindication. Child Protective Services doesn't grant access casually. If he had been deemed a danger to Meadow, he wouldn't have been allowed within sight of her. The fact that the visit happened at all suggests that authorities may be reassessing his standing in the broader case. While Daniel has appeared publicly, answered questions, cooperated with law enforcement, and even volunteered for polygraph and drug tests, Malaya has remained silent. She has refused public statements, declined interviews, and reportedly severed all communication with Daniel. When confronted with theories about the children's whereabouts, her only response has been, "I can't even listen to that." The contrast is stark. One parent attempting to rebuild his relationship with his remaining child under official supervision, the other retreating into secrecy with no public acknowledgement of either sorrow or responsibility. This contradiction between Malaya's love for her children and her ultimate abandonment of one of them points to the most disturbing possibility of all, that her attempt to protect them may have destroyed the very thing she was trying to save. Subscribe now if you want to see how this story ends, because 98% of you watch without subscribing, and that honestly makes it harder for us to get these stories the attention they deserve. What we've uncovered next will challenge everything you thought you knew about missing children cases. 9 months have passed since Lily and Jack Sullivan vanished from their rural Nova Scotia home. 9 months of searching, theorizing, and heartbreak. 9 months of a mother's silence and a stepfather's desperate cooperation. 9 months of questions that seem to multiply rather than resolve. Today, the case remains officially open, but the trail has grown cold. No Amber Alert was ever issued. No arrests have been made. No bodies have been found. And most haunting of all, no verified sightings of the children have been confirmed by law enforcement. The RCMP's silence has been deafening. Despite intense public pressure, they have released minimal information, issued no updates, and offered no explanation for their apparent inaction. This isn't incompetence, it's strategy. They may already know more than they're revealing, building an airtight case, while the public speculates in the dark. Or they may know nothing at all. The theories that captivated followers of this case, the Plattsburgh hairdresser, the Indigenous reserves, the network of women helping Malaya, remain unproven. The anonymous witness never stepped forward. The psychic visitor was never identified. The boot prints led nowhere. The note that law enforcement confirmed exists has never been released or explained. What we're left with is a story built on the fog of uncertainty, where every clue seems to contradict the last. But perhaps that fog is the point. Perhaps in our desperate need for answers, we've missed the most important truth of all. This case was never really about missing children. It was about a mother so broken by generational trauma that she couldn't see the difference between protection and destruction. It was about a system so fundamentally flawed that it created the very thing it claimed to prevent. It was about 2 innocent children caught in the crossfire of adult pain they never deserved to carry. Malaya Brooks Murray remains missing. Some believe she's hiding in the United States with Lily and Jack, living under assumed names in a community that protects its own. Others fear something far darker, that her attempt to save her children ended in tragedy, and the silence that surrounds this case is the silence of grief too profound for words. Daniel Martel continues his supervised visits with Baby Meadow, slowly rebuilding a relationship with the only child he has left. For him, those moments holding his daughter represent hope, proof that not everything was lost when his family shattered that May morning. But for the rest of us, the Sullivan case serves as a mirror, reflecting our failures as a society. We failed Malaya long before we lost track of her children. We failed to address the intergenerational trauma that shaped her worldview. We failed to provide adequate mental health support for a struggling mother. We failed to create a child welfare system that felt safe rather than threatening to vulnerable families. Most importantly, we failed Lily and Jack Sullivan, 2 children who deserved safety, stability, and love, not the chaos of adult decisions they were too young to understand. The hardest part isn't the mystery. It's the certainty that this tragedy was preventable. If we had recognized trauma before it exploded, if we had prioritized healing over punishment, if we had built systems that supported families rather than fractured them. Instead, we're left with questions that may never be answered. Where are Lily and Jack Sullivan? Are they safe? Are they alive? Do they remember the home they left behind? Do they know that people are still looking for them? And perhaps most painfully, in our quest to protect children, How many more families will we destroy before we learn that love isn't always enough, but it's still the only place healing can begin? The truth is, cases like this don't end with neat resolutions. They end with the recognition that real life is messier, more complex, and more heartbreaking than any true crime documentary can capture. They end with the understanding that behind every missing child is a family system that failed long before anyone called police. They end with the hope that by telling these stories, by forcing ourselves to confront the uncomfortable realities they reveal, we might prevent the next tragedy from ever beginning. Thank you for following Malaya's story to the end. If this case moved you, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that deserve to be heard, stories that challenge us to look beyond the headlines and ask harder questions about the systems we've built and the people they leave behind. Share your thoughts, your feelings, and your final theory in the comments. Because while we may never know what really happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan, we can still honor their memory by demanding better for the children who remain at risk today. And to the 98% of you who watched this entire story without subscribing, I have to ask, what is it going to take? These stories matter. These families deserve our attention. If you won't support this work, at least tell us why in the comments. What would make you care enough to hit that subscribe button? Because somewhere out there, Lily and Jack Sullivan are still missing, and their story deserves to be remembered.